Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in person and online. And we very much apologize for the delay. It's actually quite difficult to get to COP at the moment with all the traffic. And so we're still awaiting some speakers, but we're just going to go ahead and get started with the speakers that we have here. I wanted to welcome you to this COP28 side event on adaptation and resilience, hosted by the African Union Pavilion, and Global Health Strategies. We are looking today at tackling climate-sensitive infectious diseases in Africa and mainstreaming gender in climate action. So to give a little context, I think that we're all very much aware that climate change exacerbates the challenges associated with climate-sensitive diseases. You know, Africa deals with an average of 2 to 4 outbreaks per week. And that includes, you know, vector-borne threats like malaria and dengue, but also cholera and other diseases that are sensitive to climate. And so as we continue to be in this climate crisis, the question is, what is Africa going to do? And we know that despite low contributions to greenhouse gases, so Africa as a continent only contributes about 4%, yet it remains the most vulnerable continent. And we've all heard a lot about responsibility of high-income countries who are the largest contributors of greenhouse gases to Africa and other low middle-income countries. Yet, less than 25% of what is needed has been committed when we think about adaptation finance. Okay, so we have Africa as the most vulnerable continent, but then when we look in Africa, the most vulnerable population are women. And so the question is, when we talk about adaptation financing, we need to think about who's paying and where is that money going to, right? And we need to really think about, you know, is there a gender lens when we talk about health and the climate crisis? So this is what this side event aims to do. I'm just going to give a quick introduction of our speakers that are here. And after the introduction, we'll have a short 4-minute video from one of the speakers. 1 second. All right, so the speaker giving the video talk would be Zakari Ali, who is a research fellow on climate and health with the Medical Research Unit in the Gambia at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Then we have Anita Sonia, who is a climate advocate and global youth champion for the UN-hosted Sanitation and Water for All. Then we have Emmanuel Siakilo, who is a climate expert of sustainable environment and within the Blue Economy Directorate of the African Union. And then finally, joining us shortly will be Chido Mpemba, who is the Special Envoy on Youth at the African Union Commission. So let's start with Zakari Ali, the Research Fellow on Climate and Health, and his video remarks. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are joining us from. I am sorry I cannot join you in person in Dubai as I would have wished to, but I'm happy to be able to join you virtually. And I am an author of the recent Lancet Countdown on Climate and Health in the World, with particular focus on Africa. And our recent data shows that Africa continues to be disproportionately impacted by climate change, but is uniquely positioned with its natural resources to drive change. The hard-won development gains of the past few decades in Africa are already being eroded by the negative impacts of climate change, as we see with our data. There are severe risks of being affected by extreme heat, drought, floods, as most African countries are currently experiencing, and sea level rise that are threatening livelihoods of almost 600 million small-scale producers worldwide. and in particular, Africa is agriculture is the primary source of income and GDP in Africa. Smallholder farmers are mainly the custodians of land and nature and biodiversity in Africa, but they are at risk of adverse climate risk that draws them to poverty. A green growth agenda for Africa must therefore include anticipatory adaptation to climate impacts and support socioeconomic drive to change. Importantly, an African green growth must aim to leave no one behind. What we mean is that it must start with most people that find themselves in agriculture because they contribute most to our economy. African countries should leverage their wealth of natural resources, including around 30% of the world's mineral reserves, to further develop green and renewable technologies that have become crucial and critical to the world's development in terms of green transition. Climate funding is really critical to all of this. And we show from our data that between 2010 and 2019, African governments have done their best and have more than tripled investments in renewable energies up to around 47 billion US dollars. But Africa still is lagging behind in the green transition despite abundant green resources. Our data show that effective adaptation can lead to better financial returns, both in terms of reducing losses in bad years and also increasing gains in average or good years. I would like to end here by urging our negotiators that our data suggests that annual flows of developed income from developed countries to developing countries are currently around 29 billion per annum, which is only about 34% of total climate finance and is short of the 50-50 split that our UN Secretary General Guterres is proactively calling for. I would just end by saying that Africa, from our data, is well placed to lead the green transition with its resources, but it's currently bearing the brunt of climate effects on health. And with the right support, Africa can be the lead force in sustainable development. Thank you.
So our thanks to Dr. Zakari. So what he really did was give us the key findings to the Atlantic Countdown on Climate Change and Health report, which was released 2 weeks ago. And he mentioned several things that were found, several findings, including, the economic effects of climate change in Africa, which will affect people's livelihoods, the effects to agriculture, the challenges that come with the rises of sea level. And he talked about climate funding being central to really, adapt systems and adapt infrastructure so that Africa can still thrive within these challenges. So we thank him. And I actually didn't introduce myself, so let me do that. My name is Dr. Ngozi Irandu, and I am the Technical Director at the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. So very nice to meet you all. Thank you for attending today. Now I just want to go straight to Anita, who is our climate advocate and global youth champion for the UN. Now, Anita, you told me that you've been a climate advocate since 2018, and that means that you've been leading youth organizations, working in communities, and you've also had quite a lot of exposure to indigenous communities as well. Could you talk to us a little bit about, how this crisis plays out when we think of women's lives, how it impacts the health of these communities, and how you see what you see as like the most urgent needs when we think about the climate crisis, women, and health?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you very much. I come from the Maasai community in Kenya, which is one of the most affected communities, a community of pastoralists, a community that has faced adverse effects of climate change, with the recent ones being droughts. And usually, even with rainfalls, we do experience flooding, so we don't have the balance. And over time, we've seen droughts cause other social issues, for example, loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, um, water and sanitation challenges in the community, which also leads to lack of food. And as we all know, women provide for their families. So when there is drought, then they're not able to provide. And during this season, we also have fathers and sons leaving to move their cattle in search of pasture. And so that means as the girl also stays to help the mother fetch water in long distances, then the children tend to miss school. And also, if you look at the, the, the nexus between climate change and the gender issues, yeah. And one of the main challenges as well is that the local leaders and the communities themselves are not really well involved when it comes to making decisions on what affects them. And another thing is that always looking at communities as victims and not really looking at them as still the same people that can contribute to providing solutions. In a community that I work with, for example, recently we were able to visit some of them, and they taught us how they practice farmer-managed natural regeneration. And so that is to show that also as communities, they don't stop at being victims, but are also on the forefront in providing solutions. Therefore, they need to be more involved, and also looking at local leaders, for example, are they really aware of how they can help with the existing policies or whatever is being pushed for at COP28, because then if we talk about climate financing, for example, then how is it streamlined to make sure that it reaches the community? And without the local leaders, it becomes hard. And with that, I'm also in the last election in Kenya, I ran for office for the position of Member of Parliament in a Green Party, and Green parties are not really common in Africa at the moment. But for me, it was because I really understand the need to have our legislators, our parliamentarians, our local leaders to just be aware of climate issues. And even though I did not win, we are still trying to also work with the existing ones to make sure that they understand these issues, they see the urgency, so that they can allocate the necessary resources for adaptation. Thank you.
Anita, thank you so much, and it's really inspiring to hear that you ran for parliament, and I'm sure the next time you run, you will win, so that's excellent to hear. I mean, you talked about communities not waiting for the local leaders to, do something for them, that they're already innovating. Can you tell us a little bit more about the solutions that you've seen at the community level?
Mm-hmm. So the first one that I shared, which was farmer-managed natural regeneration, is one of the mechanisms that communities in the arid and semi-arid regions, and for our project we've had it in 4 counties in Kenya, arid and semi-arid regions. And what they do is basically try to grow the existing trees that grow naturally, try to maintain them. And this is because when we were engaging the communities, some of them told us that we get trained every day about planting trees, but if I have little water, I will have to think about, do I have to water the tree, or do I have to use the water for home purposes? And so for them, FMNR is really working well, and they've been able to restore degraded land. And other things is that we work with one of the women who train other women on smart farming and kitchen garden in those areas, using minimal water to be able to produce food for themselves. And they train other women they train trainers who train different people in the society. And yeah, so those are some of them.
No, that's very interesting. And, I think the last example you gave really talks about what adaptation looks like and how women can really, support other women to change, kind of decades of culture of how they cook and how they prepare food, because that's the lengths that it will take, which really I think emphasizes the need for this financing to have programs such as the one that you described. My last question for you is, what are the next steps in your advocacy following COP28, and how do you plan to maintain that these issues stay at the top of the agenda? You said you're going to run for parliament again. I think we have a couple more years for that, so maybe you can tell us, the next steps at the national and the continental level.
Yeah. So we all agree that real action happens outside COP. I'm happy to be part of the Africa Youth Caravan, where we highlight stories of innovations of other youths, and this is simply because we believe that our stories are our strengths, and we focus on amplifying the unheard and untold voices from the grassroots who are doing amazing work, and this links them to funding for them to scale up their projects. That is one. Second is that what I mentioned about making sure that we are working, we find a space for the communities on the table and with our leaders, and happy that we have the parliamentarians dialogue going on the sidelines of COP. And so making sure that back at home they're able to be involved. And another is that through my foundation, the Soina Foundation, we are focusing on behavior change, so capacity building and training, to be able to encourage the communities to change. And the key reason is that, for example, in the case of sanitation, which is directly linked to health, you find that there are communities that, because of cultural reasons, do not construct toilets, not because they cannot afford to do it, but then when we encourage them and teach them and capacity build them, then with behavior change, that is, that is what sustainability really looks like. So those are some of the things that we are working on.
Thank you so much. And maybe you can say the name of your foundation again, and maybe a website or Instagram so people can reach out.
Yes, for sure. The foundation is the Soina Foundation, just like from my last name. And that's what we use on all our digital platforms. And our website is www.thesoinafoundation.org. And from the website, you can be able to see how we can collaborate, how we can partner on the issues that we work on. Yes.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was very enlightening. We appreciate that. Maybe we can give her a round of applause before I go to the next speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, for our next speaker, we have Emmanuel Siakilo, who's the climate expert of sustainability, environment, and the Blue Economy Directorate at the Africa Union. Emmanuel, thanks so much for joining us this day. So it's been a real monumental year for the African Union with the organization of the Africa Climate Summit, and now, you're taking these outcomes from the summit to COP28. So could you tell us a bit about, the Nairobi Declaration and the other AU policies when we're thinking about that in the lens of, gender and climate and health? Can you just kind of elucidate that for us? And then tell us what this means when we think about adaptation financing for the member states.
Right. Thanks so much. So first I need to mention that I'm speaking on behalf of Director Nyambe, who couldn't make it here this morning. Director Nyambe is the Director for Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy, and so he's my director. So just then to the declaration. So the Africa Leaders Declaration on Climate Change and Call to Action was an immediate output of the Africa Climate Summit that was held in Nairobi, right? And so from that, then the African heads of state and governments came up with an 11-point roadmap that sort of elucidates what needs to be done for the continent as far as tackling climate action is concerned. But key in that declaration is about adaptation financing. And we really understand the reason why there was a lot of emphasis on adaptation. As I've always said, Africa requires a lot more of adaptation mechanisms rather than mitigation, because for obvious reasons. I mean, Africa as a continent does not have emissions to cut. Africa has emissions to avoid, all right? So the people who have emissions to cut are the ones who should concentrate a lot more on mitigation. And so the continent needs to concentrate a lot more on adaptation, right? And so if you look at that declaration, you find quite a number of commitments, but the commitment that sort of cross-cuts is around adaptation financing. But most importantly is how the Africa Union has turned this around in a way that then ensures that member states are able to attend to those commitments. And so the Africa Union has developed an implementation mechanism, what we are calling an action plan, that is going to help the member states to sort of action those commitments based on their various contexts in the continent, right? So one of the key areas that we have focused on is on trying as much as possible to have gender-responsive indicators across all the clusters. So we have 6 thematic clusters ranging from renewable energy to adaptation and resilience, to green agriculture, to our climate resilient agriculture, if you may like, to blue economy and so on. But most importantly, even as we look at key performance indicators for those clusters, we have deliberately included indicators for gender responsive, kind of inclusion. And the reason is simple. Ordinarily, climate change affects people of different gender differently, right? And if you take an example of COVID-19, for example, then you realize that a lot more impact was felt for women. Why? Because they rely a lot more on climate-sensitive resources, right? So when they were not able to go out and reach out these resources, then that sort of curtails their ability to take care of their families. And so the thinking is, if you anchor adaptation on gender-responsive kind of frameworks, then you sort of end up with some better results more broadly, right? Because then that is a key component to think about. So the climate, the declaration sort of attends to the climate action a lot more in the sense that it has that climate finance component, and would like as much as possible to ensure that gender is integrated, in all these clusters. And key, related to that declaration, is what we call the Africa Union Green Recovery Action Plan, okay? So that is sort of another framework that the Africa Union came up with to ensure that member states in the continent sort of bounce back better after COVID, right? So we sort of thinking through how do countries tackle climate change simultaneously with COVID and other infectious diseases, because they are related, right? So you realize that the kind of infections that we have today are as a result of the changing climate. So how do we then ensure that countries bounce back, recover from COVID-19, while simultaneously tackling the crisis that climate change presents? And that is what yielded the Africa Union Green Recovery Action Plan. It has 5 main pillars. So one of them is renewable energy. The other one is climate resilient agriculture. We have biodiversity and nature-based solutions, right? Then we have the green cities. So if you look at all these components of the GRAP, we call it GRAP in short, financing is key, of course, because as we said, again, all of these 5 pillars can only be implemented when there's financing. And that, again, piggybacks to adaptation financing. And because of this, we have established a climate finance desk at the Africa Union. And in that climate finance desk, we have a gender component. So we specifically have gender experts who are handling the issue around integrating the indicators for gender across all the 5 pillars of that Green Recovery Action Plan. We are already at Pillar 1 for climate finance, and we already done a results framework for that. If you look at that results framework, gender is very pronounced, and again, that is very deliberate, right? So, of course, gender would mean men or women, but I think a lot more emphasis is on women, because historically, I think women have been marginalized around these discussions. And so those are the 2 main instruments that we are actually working on. The other, which of course is not an instrument, but perhaps just something to mention, is the fact that the AU is now a member of the G20, right? And so that means that then the AU has an opportunity, to sort of be a strategic partner in the discussions around sustainable health financing, something that has never happened before. And so we are hoping that the Africa Union joining the G20 will present a very good opportunity for member states, to sort of be on the table in terms of having sustainable health financing for their various continents. Yeah. Thanks. Let me stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hello? Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. That was really comprehensive. I think we got a lot of insight about the work that Africa Union is doing. I'm really going to kind of walk away with what you said about Africa doesn't have emissions to cut. They have emissions to avoid. And I think that's really a conversation that, or a specific position that Africa has that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily have, other than the smaller island states, right? Because we usually get pulled into the conversations about mitigation, even though adaptation is very much needed in Africa. But I did want to go back to some of the 5 pillars that you talked about within the action plan. I didn't explicitly hear a pillar on health. I could have missed it, but I got agriculture, biodiversity, real cities, renewable energy, and climate finance was the 5th one for the pillar.
The 5th one is on urban resilient green cities.
Green cities.
Yeah.
So could you talk to us a bit about how health is integrated within those different pillars? I mean, you talked a bit about like how there is an actual desk that is looking at integrating gender within those indicators. But can you give us an example about how health are part of those pillars as well?
Well, I think we look at health as cross-cutting here, because if you have healthy environment, then clearly you have a healthy population, right? And so we do not have a standalone pillar on health in the policy yet. But if you're talking about climate resilient agriculture, for example, that essentially means sustainable agriculture, right? And so if it's sustainable, then we are thinking of having, a more healthier population. If you're thinking about greener cities, so you're thinking about cities that are devoid of pollution, all right? And so the other strategy, which has not been launched yet, perhaps that's why I didn't mention it, is on air quality, so air monitoring and quality, which will be launched, I think, in the course of next year. But what that looks at is how cities in Africa can sort of work towards reducing air pollution, right? And if you reduce air pollution, clearly you're then tackling some of the air-related kind of illnesses. So health is actually cross-cutting, because if you talk about renewable energy, it means you're moving away from fossil fuels, right? Which sort of affects the health of the population a lot more. You're moving away from dependency on biomass, for example. If you're talking about, sustainable, climate smart agriculture, then you're moving away from unsustainable agricultural practices, right? So I think for us, it's about having health cross-cutting all these pillars. Health and gender are actually cross-cutting all these pillars. That's why we don't have any standalone pillar on health as yet.
Thank you so much for the explanation. As a disease epidemiologist, I'm always very keen to hear how health is specifically articulated, so I will be looking at the indicators, because it's like what you said at the beginning, the effect on infectious diseases, on vector-borne diseases, is going to be, it is already a big issue in Africa, and it's going to be worse. But then there's also heat, and I think Anita made some very good links to drought and food security, and it just goes on and on. It's very much connected. So I very much look forward to those plans, and I think air quality is excellent to really pull that out, because we know that respiratory issues have significantly increased with the particulates in the air. So that is very important. Now, we only have 10 minutes left, so I want to open it up to the audience here for question and answer for our panelists today. So over to you. One second, we're just going to get another microphone.
You might have to use this.
Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations. Yeah, so first and foremost, I just want to make a comment, and then I can ask for feedback. Pardon? Okay, I'm Lusajo Ambukege. I'm from African Union Commission working with multi-hazard early warning systems. Yeah, so the first comment I wanted to make is that I think it's important, learning from COVID-19, I think it is important to look at health systems, not in isolation, but from a holistic point of view. Why do I say so? From COVID-19, what we learned was, looking at health, it was not just health in isolation, because there are other sectors that equally have a bearing on the health sector. For example, issues of social protection, issues of water and sanitation, issues of infrastructure, equally have a bearing on health systems. So I think it's also important to look at it from the systems point of view, from a holistic point of view, looking at other auxiliary sectors that may need also financing, which have a bearing on the health sectors. But the other thing that caught my mind so much was the issue of sustainability. So the question is, how can we ensure that our health systems, that's why I say we should not look at it just from the sector, but as a system. How can we ensure that the health system is sustainable enough, regardless of the challenges that we may have arising from climate change and other disaster risks that affect the sector? So what kind of investments do we need to ensure that the sector is sustainable enough? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for a great discussion. My name is Nchiko Anchiko. I'm from Amnesty International, and I work on climate justice in East and Southern Africa. Just like 3 quick questions. The first one goes mainly to Dr. Ngozi, but really also just to the whole panel. Which particular infectious disease do we have in mind here? And one to Soina. You've spoken about how indigenous communities in Kenya, particularly the Maasai, have been interacting with climate change. So I just wanted to know, from your experience, who are they blaming for this injustice? Also, maybe a smaller one, can you make a comment on young climate change activists during their engagement with COP? Is there something that you think we could be doing differently? Because even for myself, it's my first time at the COP, but I'm finding most discussions to be really high level, that as a young person, other than calling out the injustice, it's really hard to branch into the conversations, to follow through them. And as a result, I'm just wondering, how are we then able as young people, as young activists to make recommendations? Also, it's really good to have 2 people from the African Union here, and this will take me to the Nairobi Declaration. So the last line of the declaration says that the African Commission, the African Union, will have to come up with an implementation framework of the Nairobi Declaration. So we've met in Nairobi in September. We've said this is our common voice, but how are we going to implement it? How are we going to exactly speak with that common voice at the COP? And so far, there's no implementation framework, and the operationalization of the loss and damage fund was just adopted. Like, again, it feels like it was just imposed on African countries, because speaking of an implementation framework, we could have said, this is our voice on that particular issue. And finally, the Nairobi Declaration, of course, is amazing in so many ways. But as a human rights activist, it's not really anchored on human rights. And I think this is why we are struggling with the question related to health, because it doesn't really appreciate like a number of rights such that we can say that as far as the right to health is concerned, this is what the Nairobi Declaration is saying. And without anchoring it on human rights, then the question of responsibility becomes really tricky. So how do we hold state accountable to the Nairobi Declaration? How do we hold the African Union or like your department to the Nairobi Declaration? Thank you, sorry.
Great questions, thank you. I think we're going to give an opportunity to the panel now to answer. We will go back to my brother's question that he started with.
Yes, thank you so much for those questions. I'll just say them again and then hand it over to our panelists. So the first question, well, first the speaker made some points about just systems perspective from the, when we're thinking about adaptation financing. But he also asked, how can we ensure that when we're thinking about health system resilience to health threats, whether those threats be climate or pandemic or whatever, how do we ensure that the health system is financed sustainably? I think, that we talk about a systems framework and how it's interlinked, but then he also mentioned specifically the health system. Then the question, I think maybe Emmanuel, you can take that. And I can say something on it if you'd like. And then Anita, there was a question for you about indigenous communities and who they blame. And another question to you about what is your advice to young people in terms of getting into the conversation, especially at places like COP28 where it's really high level. And then Emmanuel, another question for you was about the implementation of the Nairobi Declaration. I think you told us a little bit when you talked about some of the response plans, but you can maybe expand on that. And then where is human rights when we talk about the Nairobi Declaration? How is human rights embedded in that? So I'm going to, I know you have a question for me as well, but I'm going to start with the panelists. So Anita, maybe you can start and then over to Emmanuel.
Thank you. So the first question is who are the indigenous communities blaming? And we've had this so many times when we visit the communities and when we ask them what they acknowledge is, yes, we see the changes, the change in weather patterns, things have been changing over time. But then when we ask, do you know what causes it? They're like, we don't know. And sometimes it's God's punishment, for example, and not really understanding that it's climate change, what climate change is, but they feel the effects and they know that the changes are happening. And so that is why we also engage much in climate education for them to really understand how we came to be where we are and how they can be able to adapt to some of these effects. Your second interesting question is about the youth, and for sure my first COP was COP26. And I remember the whole of week one, I didn't know, I was just roaming from one pavilion to another, going for receptions, and that was it, because nobody told me what COP looks like, and that it's that you have maybe to follow up on some thematic areas for you to not to get lost in so many things happening at the same time. And I think there's a need that, and I wish Chida was here, because there's a need for for example, her office as the youth envoy to capacity build, even if it's some weeks to COP, young people, so that they are told what is happening at COP, how they can engage meaningfully, so that it's not a 2-week trip off our work and back home. And that is what we are doing this year with the Africa Youth Caravan. We were able to capacity build delegates in our country, that is in Kenya, some delegates, educated them on how COP looks like, told them how to engage and how to also take advantage of COP for them to be able to meet necessary support for their projects back home. And I think that is something that we need. So if the different youth offices and the youth leadership that we have across come together and think of a way to really make it meaningful for young people, so that we are also not just coming here to maybe speak outside meeting rooms, but also be meaningfully engaged inside the meeting rooms. Yeah, I think that's...
Right. So the issue around sustainable health. One, I think governments need to be very deliberate about prioritizing health, right? Because, I mean, that shouldn't be an addendum. It should be a standalone pillar where resources are channeled, because then if you don't make it deliberate, it becomes very difficult for you to have a sustainable health financing system. And I understand in the context of developing nations that if we do not have sufficient adaptation financing flows, then we end up utilizing what would have gone into these sectors like health for adaptation. And that's why we keep insisting that we require sufficient resources for adaptation, so that money meant for sectors like health and education and so on are actually utilized for that specific purpose. But as I've said, we have to be very deliberate about setting aside resources for health financing. And I like the thinking, Lusajo, that you raised about system thinking, because you can't attend to health as a standalone. I mean, it's so connected to other sectors. For example, I mean, you can only attend to health pretty well if you have information, say from early warning, systems, because then you get to know where it is you are headed, what are likely disasters to happen, and how do you mitigate against them? What will be the potential impacts on health, for example? You have to link this to food security, right? So the discussion for health is so interlinked with all these other sectors. And that, for me, would make health more sustainable, because then you are linking it to other sectors. So it cannot just be handled as a standalone, but we need to be very deliberate. And in terms of the declaration, we already have an implementation framework, as I said. It's only that we have not launched it, but it's actually available as we speak. So we only need to share it with member states for their input, and then we concretize it, right? So the Africa Union has already developed that implementation plan. And that plan is so elaborate, it's so comprehensive in terms of what exactly needs to be done for the commitments. So those are the objectives. We have set aside what we think would be the desired outcomes for each of those commitments. What would we be measuring in terms of the target? So what is the baseline? Where do you want to get to? Right? Who is responsible for attaining this kind of targets? What are the indicators for measuring success? And what is the duration that we think those indicators can be measured over time, all right? So that is actually available. It's just about sending it to member states for their inputs, and then we have it, we run around with it. And just to mention here is that the Africa Union mandate runs over policy and coordination. We don't go into implementation. We have other implementing organs, like AUDA NEPAD, for example. So ours is to develop a tool like an implementation plan, and then to provide the policy guidance and coordinate and ensure that this is happening. And that is actually in place. In terms of having a common position, so the declaration was supposed to provide a common position for the continent in this COP. And the Africa group of negotiators is the mouthpiece for the continent. They have already done that. We have a position paper, just in case you haven't gotten one, I can share. There's a position paper that talks about all these strategic issues that the continent needs to address. Issues around loss and damage, for example, are well articulated in that position paper. Issues around adaptation and resilience is well articulated. Just energy transition is well articulated, right? And renewable energy and so on. And I like your point that the framework doesn't necessarily provide a description of human rights, all right? But my thinking would be that if you have sufficient adaptation, so then you are able to provide for your populace in times of disasters, then you are actually addressing human rights, all right? My thinking would be that if you have just energy transition kind of narratives, and you're able to define what just means, so that then you are transiting to renewable energy at the scale and speed that doesn't violate the rights of the people, then you're addressing human rights, right? So it may not really be succinct, it may not be coming out so explicitly, but if you look through those sectors clearly, then you realize there's a component of human rights. But I actually agree that we should have it as a standalone so that we're able to measure the indicators around human rights as well. Let me stop there, thanks. Yeah. It's the Africa group of negotiators position paper for COP28. No, it's not online, I know. It's not online as yet. And the reason is that it's still being tweaked because there are negotiations going on. But I can share a copy if you need one. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Just going to go back to Anita quite quickly before I wrap up for a mention.
Okay, I just wanted to share that the Africa Women for Climate, I wanted to share that the Africa Women for Climate do have a petition that is addressing the African leaders to mainstream gender in adaptation measures, and it's on the website that is africanwomenforclimate.org, and the 4 is letter 4. So you can check it out and help to sign the petition and share. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anita. I think we all should definitely go on there. I mean, just to wrap up, I want to thank our panelists for their insightful contributions. I think we got a very good kind of overview on what the policy stances of the African Union are, but also what are the real lives of communities, indigenous communities, women in different countries, like what are their experiences and how this adaptation financing is really important for them. I think a lot of things have come out as well from the audience which I really appreciate. One is that health must be deliberate, but also multi-sectoral, as we all know. But also human rights must be deliberate, right? And when we talk about gender, we also must be deliberate. And so it's very good to hear that there are indicators that are going to be measuring the progress of, I think, I hope it includes not only the impact on gender, but also how much money is getting to women, how many programs are targeted to women and are for women, because otherwise we'll lose it, right? We know if we don't articulate something, then it doesn't usually get done. So I think I'll end by saying this also is another call to people outside the room, as well as, you know, the largest contributors of greenhouse gases, which are high-income countries, and they really need to be on the same page with us when it comes to fully funding climate adaptation in Africa, because Africans were not the ones who caused it to begin with. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to Global Health Strategies, and thank you to our panelists.